Hi guys, in today's post I'm talking about what I call the movement pyramid, inspired by someone who I'll be having on the podcast in a couple of weeks' time, who has had more coaching experience than I've had years in my life, and someone who's worked at the upper echelons of elite sport as well as with kids. And for me, if you found something that works with kids and you found what works with elite athletes, then that's someone who's going to be worth listening to. Anyway, the movement pyramid is an idea that I've stolen from this person, because oftentimes when we see a pyramid, you've got the fundamental movement skills as the base layer, which is great, and the sport specific stuff built on top of it. But I'd like to explore the fundamental movement skills a little bit further. So firstly, are you efficient with the fundamental movement skills? What I basically mean is, can you perform a good quality rep once? Now, I know that sounds a bit dry and boring, and I'm not suggesting that when we coach kids that we nail that perfect rep or we drill that perfect rep until they do that and we don't do anything else. But what I'm saying is that we need to at least have something that looks adequate, something that looks confident and competent in a movement quality. Now, I like Brett Klicker's 4-point sliding scale. So a 0 would be you can't perform the movement at all and it causes you pain, just refer out. 2 would be something like you get it right half of the time. 4 would be textbook. So I wouldn't say that we necessarily need it perfect, but let's at least get something that looks right half the time before we start to stress it. And when I say stress it, I don't just necessarily mean add load or add repetitions. Now, although that's certainly an option, there are other ways we can tweak a movement pattern. So can we work at different levels of tension, for example? So if we're doing something like a push-up position plank, can we, for example, hold it for a certain time period, or can we drive up the tension to make it as difficult as possible? So the analogy I would use with kids is, if there was a hurricane, you're the last thing left standing. You can certainly turn this into a more dynamic movement and have kids, for example, press up wrestle. You can have them playing ping pong, where they're trying to breathe the ball between their partner's arms. So now you're dialing up and down the tension. They're now having to move with it. They're now having to think about it. So now, just like that, we've stressed the movement pattern differently. In my upcoming youth athlete ebook, I'll be talking about various variables that you can tweak with each of the movement patterns, so squat, hinge, lunge, push, pull, so that there's still progression there. However, it's not necessarily just diving straight towards a weight, and depending on your facilities and the context in which you're coaching kids, that might not even be available. So can we do one decent rep? Next, can we do it consistently? So I know I said about not just adding reps for lazy coaching, but for example, you might find with kids they nail that one rep and then on the 10th repetition they get fatigued, they lose concentration, even stuff like a lack of balance. In previous roles I've had with a tennis club, I remember doing overhead squat screens, which is something they did with all the kids, and they were talking about whether a kid had, for example, overactive adductors or weak glutes. I was like, that kid just hasn't been exposed to multiple repetitions of squatting, and they haven't had that put in several different environments. So for example, can we change the tempo? Yesterday I mentioned about goblet squats with a full cup of water on top of the dumbbell. Maybe we can do it fast. Something I've been doing with my kids in rounders is, just as a warm-up, you'll chuck them a ball, and then all of a sudden stumping a base becomes a speed squat. You might do something like rocket tag, where somebody gets tagged, and rather than stuck in the mud, they sit down in the squat, and when they get freed, they explode up. So now all of a sudden we've got an explosive squat. So we've just changed several different variables without ever needing to say, right, let's just add more reps. We can be a bit more creative than that. So is the movement pattern efficient? Is it consistent? Is it resilient to stress? So for example, at different speeds, at different loads, with different tensions, maybe even combining movements. So for example, maybe you're doing something like so GMB Fitness, their monkey movement, which is basically a sidewards or rotational entry into a squat. And finally, at the top of the tree, conditioning. What does it look like under fatigue? If we are going to do conditioning for kids, which I've talked about extensively this week, we need to make sure that it's appropriate for their pubertal status. So for example, high intensity stuff, there's much better uses of time, because puberty itself is going to accelerate strength, speed and power. So I'd probably recommend playing about with some of those variables I've already stated. If kids are past puberty, then I'd still be looking to refine stuff like sprint mechanics, change of direction work, and jumping and landing before I probably worried about conditioning. Remember, conditioning or endurance is easy. We just add more. Building efficiency, building consistency, building resilience, that is going to be more difficult. Hope you found this useful. Catch you again in the next video.